Well, good evening and welcome to the third of our classes on the letter from James. As the nation continues to be locked down and we're maintaining our social distance in order to save lives, we've scheduled these weekday classes in an effort to help provide opportunities for any who want to join in and learn more about Jesus and his teachings. So here we are, lesson 3 on our short study of the letter from James. We are working through this outline and essentially hitting the highlights as we go along. And this evening we're going to be looking at a section that addresses testing and temptation. So last week we began to look at this section of scripture in which James challenges the way we think in a number of different areas. We considered a 1990s advertising campaign in which computer users were challenged to think different. And I suggested that this was essentially the message of this first part of the letter. This is an essential teaching of Jesus, that we must be prepared to think different, to think about everything in ways that are completely different from the world around us, even in ways that are completely different from so much of the religious world. And I suggested that there were 3 areas of thinking which James specifically addresses. The way that we think about trials, the way we think about money and wealth, and the way we think about desires and pleasure, although all these are somehow or other interrelated. So we looked at the first and the second last week, and this evening then we're going to begin by looking at what he has to say concerning our thinking about desires and pleasure. And then we'll see what he has to say about trials, temptations, the progression of our sin, and every good and every perfect gift. Let's begin by looking at this whole idea of desires and pleasure. When we think of true happiness, one of this world's most popular mantras must surely be something like, if it feels good, do it. If it feels good, if it sounds good, if it looks good, if it tastes good, if it smells good, well, it must be good. So just do it. Well, the way of Christ is not like that. The way of Christ is the way of the cross. It is a way of suffering, and it's a way of self-denial. You remember when Jesus said, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it." And we're seeing, are we not, up and down the country, examples of people who are sometimes paying that ultimate price in the name of service, in the name of duty, laying down their lives for others. And we, in Christ, as disciples of Jesus, are called to deny ourselves, to lay down our lives for the good of those around us. And if we're not willing to deny ourselves, then we cannot be disciples of Jesus. I mean, that's the end of the matter. Simple as that. And it's not that Jesus didn't speak about happiness. He did. But the happiness of which he spoke was unlike the happiness of this world, for it isn't found in the things of this world. Do you remember how Jesus began his teaching on the mountain with a series of exclamations commonly referred to as the Beatitudes? Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek or the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons or children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. The idea of rejoicing in the face of suffering was certainly not new with James last week at the start of this letter. Indeed, I suggested then that James deliberately began his letter as he did in order to be somewhat outrageous, provocative. I think he began with those words that we should count it all joy, nothing but pure joy when we encounter all kinds of trials. And I think deliberately he was trying to shock his readers, and it is shocking. But I think Jesus did the same. I think Jesus deliberately set about to upset the status quo. I smile when I read of Jesus healing on the Sabbath. I can't help but think of maybe some of his disciples coming to him and saying, Jesus, teacher, rabbi, could you not have healed this man yesterday? Yeah, and saved all of this trouble. I think Jesus might have said, yeah, I could have done, but I didn't. Well, then maybe some of them coming to him and saying, Jesus, I know this person's been ill for such a long time, but could you not have just waited one more day and healed them on the first day of the week and not upset so many people? And I can hear Jesus saying, yeah, I could have done that as well, but I didn't. And then I'd see him smile. But I think the words that he spoke when he taught, even the shocking words that he spoke, they resonated, as they still do today, with the hearts of those who seek after God. So much so that when they who first heard him, when they heard his words, they recognized him as one who spoke with authority, not like the religious leaders to whom they had been accustomed to hearing. It seems that this is a general truth, that the world knows little of happiness, and its pursuit of pleasure always ultimately leads to disappointment. As Solomon observed centuries earlier, all is vanity, all is futile. The operating systems of this world, the thinking processes of this world are full of faulty codes and systems. pursuing happiness but never really finding it. But the way of Christ, the operating system of Christ, the wisdom that is from above, brings happiness in ways that are often quite unexpected. Let's get to the text here in James, here in this first chapter. He continues, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life which God has promised to those who love him." It's almost as if we're back listening to the teaching of Jesus on the mountain, isn't it? Blessed is the man. The word blessed there is a translation of a word. It's the Greek word makarios. It's the same word as that which Matthew uses in recording the teaching of Jesus that we read earlier from Matthew chapter 5. And it could be translated, how happy, how happy are the poor in spirit, or happy are those, the Good News Bible has, the Living Bible has, how very fortunate. So how very fortunate is the man who remains steadfast under trial. How happy is he? It's a word that is used, this word makarios, used in the Septuagint at least 25 times in the Psalms, generally translated, as we are familiar, blessed is. For example, in the very first Psalm, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. And again, Psalm 32, blessed is the man against whom the Lord counts no iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit. That blessedness, or true happiness, is not found by avoiding hardship or by amassing wealth. That's not where it lies. But through endurance, through perseverance, through steadfastness. I had a teacher many years ago, a man for whom I had the greatest respect. His name was Albert Winstanley. He used this word often when thinking of endurance or perseverance or steadfastness. He would use the word stickability. This stickability is a characteristic of the mature, the grown-up child of God. When the going gets tough, the faithful keep going, they endure, they persevere, they are steadfast, they show this stickability. And this, all too often, is certainly not the way of the world. And so, writes James, blessed is the man who remains steadfast. This is that steadfastness which is produced through the testing of our faith, and which, when allowed to be perfected, makes us mature and complete, as he said a little earlier on in the letter. And then James proceeds to discuss the source of our testing and the reward that comes from passing the test. A test which is ultimately about loving God. As he says, he will receive the crown of life which God has promised to those who love him. And when we love God, we prove ourselves to be faithful to him. But let's explore a little of the nature of this testing and how easily it might lead us into to temptation. Back here to the text. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life which God has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I'm being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. Notice the related words in this text here. The word trial, tempted, tempts, all come from the same root word, translated the noun form here from the word pyrasmos, speaks of trials and or temptations, and can legitimately be translated, as it has been earlier, as trials or difficulties, but can equally be translated as temptations to do evil. Well, God might allow us to be tried, but he won't tempt us. Look at this passage here from John chapter 6. You'll be familiar with the context, I'm sure. It's just before Jesus was about to feed a very large number of people with a very small amount of food. Lifting up his eyes then and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" Well, he said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Now, that's an interesting word there. He said this to test him. Well, should this be test or should it be tempt? Both would be legitimate translations. So we might ask, are they then one and the same? Well, here is a point that I think is worth noting, that this sort of endurance is not shown by those for whom times of testing or trials have become occasions for yielding to sin. The fact that God allows us to be tested cannot be used as an excuse for yielding to temptation. That is why James says, let no one say when he's tempted, well, I'm being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. There is nothing evil about God. Now, it could well be said that God tests us in order to make us stronger, whilst at the same time Satan might use such tests as a means of temptation in order to bring us down. Well, God, as we will see and as we well know, has only our ultimate good at heart. Satan, on the other hand, has quite the opposite intention. A good number of years ago, I spent the day at Chatham in Kent with the Royal Engineers, learning how to build a medium girder bridge, as you do. And it was a fascinating experience. And once the gap had been bridged, a rather large vehicle was driven across the bridge. And this was for the purpose of testing it. Not that any of us thought that the thing would collapse, but there was a need to prove its strength, that we might have confidence in it being able to do the job. Well, in many ways, our faith is like this. God will test our faith, and that in turn will strengthen it. It will strengthen our resolve, our ability to endure, to persevere. But Satan, on the other hand, he would rather seek to destroy that bridge, and would perhaps, endeavour to drive over it a very large vehicle with that purpose in mind. And so our faith is perhaps somewhat like that. God will test it. He will allow us to be tested and tried, whereas Satan, on the other hand, will seek to use such tests as a means to bring us down or to destroy us. But so closely connected are the ideas of trials or tests and temptations, that James proceeds to discuss the other side of the coin and the progression of sin. He continues that each person is tempted. When he is lured and enticed by his own desire, then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Well, maybe the first thing that we should say is that there is nothing wrong with being tempted. Everyone is tempted, but of course not everyone passes the test. When Paul is writing to believers in Corinth, he tells them that no temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation he will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. Everyone is tempted. It might be useful, incidentally, at this stage to compare this translation, which is from the ESV, the English Standard Version, with that of the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version. Look how they compare here. And look how that the words temptation, tempted in the ESV, are translated differently in the NRSV. The same word is being translated, this word pirasmos, to speak of trials, and the verb form of that, but the NRSV uses the word testing. Exactly the same word, of course, in the Greek text. God will provide this means of escape, the way out, as it were. He doesn't want us to fail the test. He doesn't want those tests to become a means of temptation to entice us to do that which is wrong. But ultimately, of course, we will fail. Not every time. There will be some noticeable achievements and victories along the way, but we will fail more times than we can ever remember, more times than we care to ever remember. But on the other hand, although everyone is tempted, well, that includes Jesus himself. He was tempted, but he never failed. He had 100% pass rate, if you like, and so becomes the perfect example and encouragement. There's a delightful passage in the book that we know as Hebrews. The writer says that we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. So let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Notice there he says, but one who in every respect, in every way as we are, has been tempted. And we might be tempted to lie, we might be tempted to steal, to harm, to kill, to be sexually immoral, to cheat, to slander, and so Jesus, we are told, has been tempted in every respect as we are, and yet without sin. Though his temptations were real, he overcame every time, and that would suggest that we cannot use temptation as an excuse for our sin. We can't say, I couldn't help it, I was tempted. No, no, no. James then continues to speak of each of us being lured and enticed by our own desire. That word desire can speak of either a desire for that which is good or a desire for that which is bad. It speaks of a strong desire, the idea of a craving. But for each of us, it will be different. He speaks of our own desire. For each of us, it'll be different, just whatever rings our bell, some might say. We each have desires, which for others may have no desire at all. One thing may have absolutely no attraction to me whatsoever, but to somebody else it might be the greatest attraction on earth. That for which some would immediately give up the world might be to another just as quickly discarded. And I'm sure we can think of such things within our own lives. I'm sure we're well aware of what our desires might be, however foolish we might think they might appear to others. But our own desires, writes James, they lure and entice us. It's a picture here of a fish being drawn off course and lured by bait. Well, somehow I must say I don't find squirming maggots to be particularly enticing, but the fish does. I mean, it wouldn't tempt me, but it certainly tempts the fish. And to take the metaphor a little further, if the luring and enticing is allowed to have its way, well, we will soon find ourselves hooked by our desires. And I'm sure that those of us who have struggled, and I hope we do all struggle, for it's when we stop struggling that we've lost the fight, yes? And I'm sure that those of us who have struggled to extremes can fully understand this picture of being lured and enticed, and that of being hooked and ensnared by those things that have been our desires, that we only long were not so. Well, James now uses a number of metaphors, some of them rather technical, in order to speak of the progression of sin leading ultimately to death. And first, there is conception. When the desire or the lust has conceived. It is the union of the will with our desire, when we allow ourselves to go along with those things which we so wrongly desire. And then, he says, it gives birth to sin. The result, the offspring, is sin. The union of the will with our desire brings forth sin. And then, when the sin is fully grown, not mature, but complete in terms of parts or function, it gives birth to death. The cycle is then complete. And the word that James here uses is a medical term of a woman giving birth to a child. A.T. Robertson, in his word pictures, says the child of lust is sin, of sin is death. Powerful figure of abortion. The child is dead at birth. A graphic picture, horrifically graphic picture. And yet such is the progression of sin within our own lives, and we've maybe seen it over and over again. So James urges us not to be deceived. For the power of sin lies in its deceit. It lies in its lies, and can only be overcome by truth. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. That phrase there, that with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change, is quite a technical phrase, an astronomical phrase to use of the way in which the light we see from the sun and stars will vary and shift according to their position in the sky. In contrast, the light from God is constant, is never changing. And far from ever tempting us in order to bring us down, God, the Father of lights, will only ever do us good. Not only is every gift that he gives both good and perfect, but he is himself the perfect giver, one in whom we can completely depend, for he never changes. He is always faithful and true. And then, in stark contrast to our own imperfect will, James says that of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. Where sin brings forth death by the word of deceitful desire, God brings forth his children by the word of truth. What an incredible contrast there is. And it's that deceit, it's the lies that are a part of the operating systems of this world. It is those that trip us up. It is those that ensnare us. It is those that enslave us. If only the fish had been able to see that deathly hook concealed by the delicious wriggling maggot. If only then he maybe would have waited a little longer for his lunch. And if only we could see the deathly hooks that are being hidden by those things that look so enticing, those things that sound so appealing, those things that feel so good. If only we could see the deathly hooks that were being concealed. If only we could see the real truth behind our desires, maybe then we wouldn't be so eager and so keen to get a hold of them and to allow our will to be overcome by them all too often. Before we close, let me recommend to you a film which I think you really ought to watch. You might have already seen it. It's been around for over 50 years now. But it contains a scene that, had James been more familiar with cinematography, he would have mentioned when writing this letter, I'm sure. The film is Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. And the scene is where that child catcher rides into the town square and lures the children from their place of hiding. Really is well worth watching. The Baron who rules over this land he despises children. So he has employed this man to catch children, appropriately known as the child catcher, and he really does look the work. He rides into town on this horse-drawn carriage that's decorated so attractively, and he knows where the children are hiding, for he can smell them. He's got a very big nose for this sort of thing. And I mean, I know one can smell children when they're very tiny, but this fella had the ability to smell them at all ages. And so he knows where they're hiding there in the toy shop. The toys, of course, are being made not for children, but for the Baron, whose birthday's coming up, but that's beside the point. So there the child catcher goes, and he's holding his lollipops, and he speaks of ice cream and lollipops and treacle tarts, and they're all free today. Now that scene is well worth watching. The whole film is worth it, even if only for that one particular scene. And when you watch it, as you really ought to do, this is your homework. When you watch it, I want you to note a couple of things in particular, but the whole scene is very well worthy of further discussion. Notice the children who themselves pursue the child catcher even after he is leaving the scene. So hooked are they, so enticed are they by his words of deceit that they go running after him and eagerly clamber aboard what ends up being nothing more than a cage on wheels. And notice even before that, how when they are being tempted by these things that the young girl says, well, we've been told we mustn't do this. We shouldn't give in to this. And the young lad, Jeremy, I think is his name, he says, well, that's okay. We'll get some for the adults too. There's a justification of their wrongdoing. And how often might we have done something the same ourselves? Maybe we've spent our money in ways that we ought not to have done, and we've justified our actions by saying, well, it'll help them, it'll give them, needed money to take care of the family or whatever else it might be. And then continuing to pursue things that we know we ought not to be pursuing. So have a watch of that that scene. Watch the whole film to see it in its context, of course, but that scene in particular is very powerful. Very well illustrates this luring and this enticing. And a little spoiler alert for you, so that you don't have nightmares or what have you. All is well in the end. Well, on that note, we will conclude our time together this week. I wish you God's blessings. May he continue to keep us safe. May he bless us that we might be a blessing to those around us. And I look forward to seeing you, Lord willing, next Monday evening at 8 o'clock as we continue our journey through this adventurous letter. Thank you, and God bless.